Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Please join me in welcoming our webcast viewers. My name is Michael Bach, and I am the CEO of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion and a director of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Viewers, thank you for joining us. Our club is proud of our track record of bringing you decision makers and thought leaders to discuss the issues of the day. We continue to attract guest speakers to our podium. We work hard to bring you not only a diversity of ideas, but a diversity of speakers as well. The digital age has not slowed us down either. We invite you to visit our website at canadianclub.org, where you can learn more about our upcoming events, purchase tickets, and become a Canadian Club Toronto subscriber to receive special benefits. You can also sign up for our newsletter so you're always up to date on the activities of the club. I also want to acknowledge our event sponsor, McCarthy Tetro, represented by Awi Sinha. It is because of the generosity of sponsors like McCarthy Tetro that we're able to put on events like this. I would also like to thank LinkedIn and One Step, who have kindly sponsored the participation of the Youth and Young Leaders Table, with attendees joining us this afternoon from C.W. Jeffries Collegiate Institute. Welcome and thank you for being here. It's time to introduce our speaker. Employment, workforce development, labor. They all have one thing in common: good quality jobs. The Federal Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labor has been mandated to help Canadians get the skills they need for good quality jobs. The government strongly believes that having a robust middle class requires Canadians to have well-paying employment opportunities. Minister Patty Hajdu embraces the challenge at hand. Well known as a compassionate advocate, she believes in helping Canadians succeed in an inclusive and supportive society. First elected in 2015, Minister Hajdu is aware that access to good quality jobs relies on training, education, and lots of collaboration. This means addressing the changing workforce, the way people work, and the needs of women and other underrepresented groups. Minister Hajdu regularly meets with provincial and territorial representatives to discuss ways that post-secondary education can be made accessible for all. She also works with her cabinet colleagues to make sure that barriers to finding work in existing and emerging sectors are reduced and eliminated. Elected Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay Superior North, she was appointed to cabinet as Minister of Status of Women shortly after election. In January of 2017, she was appointed to her current portfolio. Before entering politics, Minister Hajdu worked in public health, focusing on drug policy, youth development, and homelessness. She also ran the largest homeless shelter in northwestern Ontario. Minister Hajdu, I'm pleased to pass the Canadian Club of Toronto podium over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael and Colleen, wherever you are, for inviting me and for the excellent lunch and the fantastic company at the head table. I see people I've worked with before in so many different ways, either through politics or even prior to politics. So it's wonderful to be here with you on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit and Huron-Wendat. And it's wonderful to hear about the history of the Canadian Club and the changes that all of you reflect in the changing face of the club. I would say that, you know, your remarks, Michael, really sort of sum it up. I mean, I have come to the world of politics because I truly believe that good social policy is good fiscal policy. And I can tell you that the reason why I believe that is that the final experience prior to politics of running a homeless shelter taught me that when we do nothing, it's very expensive, and that we're not very good at calculating the cost of doing nothing. We're really good at talking about how much it costs to do something, but we're not very good at calculating the cost of doing nothing. And that was the fundamental perspective that drove me to politics, and in particular to federal politics, because I felt that as a federal politician I would have a possibility, if I was elected, which I was, to influence that way of thinking. And I've been so honored to be part of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's cabinet, where I actually get to present that perspective every day to often very willing and open colleagues who believe the same thing. So today I am going to talk about inclusive growth, and I'm going to talk about how it's connected to the agenda that you've heard us talk about, which is the growth of the middle class, and how we're doing that in collaboration with businesses, educators, and in fact Canadians. Now, you have heard us talk a lot about growing the middle class, and you know, there's a fundamental aspect of growing the middle class that I think we don't often talk about as much, and that is if we're actually going to grow the middle class, we need to get more people in it. You know, we have a stable middle class in Canada, and of course our middle class has seen some challenges in many different ways, but if we really truly fundamentally want to grow the middle class, what that means is that everybody's going to have a fair chance at success. When Canadians feel that they have that fair chance at success, they are confident, and they invest in themselves, and they spend money on their families, and they're productive, and they're entrepreneurial. I want to thank the businesses in the room today for the important work that you do every day to make sure that our economy thrives. And I want to also acknowledge that you're not just job creators, you are investors in your communities. And the reason I say that is because when I ran the largest not-for-profit homeless shelter in Thunder Bay, we were only able to do that through the generosity of businesses in our community, whether it was donations of money or time, whether it was board members that took time away from their very busy schedules to help us reach our fundraising goals. And so I want to thank you all for the contributions that you make outside of being the job creators, which is obviously a very important role. Now, why is it important to invest in good quality jobs for Canadians? It seems like it's an obvious statement, but obviously in Ontario we don't necessarily see the same perspective as our new Premier. Our government has taken bold measures to ensure that Canadians have a fair chance at success because we know that this is connected to a growing economy. And let me just get personal for a minute. I was a single mother for most of my children's lives. I left my partner when my eldest son was 3 years old. He was a butcher. I was a not-for-profit worker. There wasn't a lot of money in our family. I managed to finish university at 28. I was the first in my family to graduate with a post-secondary education. It was a game changer for my family. And it was a game changer when I got that first job at Public Health and I went from $35,000 a year to $52,000 a year. Sounds really low now when starting salaries are around $50,000 for a young graduate. But it was a huge change in our family situation. I had benefits, I had a pension. I knew that when I was sick or my children were sick, that I would be able to care for them. I had an employer that believed in flexible workplaces so that I could actually give them my best. And I stayed with that organization for 9 years. During that 9 years, I was able to develop a drug strategy for the City of Thunder Bay, which was unanimously adopted by City Council. I was able to achieve a lot of goalposts for the organization that took a chance on me. And not only did it change my life and my earning potential to work for an employer that valued my contributions and that understood the tensions between work-life balance and helped me to make that work, but it also helped my children because my children were elevated out of a lifetime of poverty, and because I was a first grad, I could actually give them a vision of post-secondary education, and they are both now college graduates as well. And so, yes, go ahead and clap. And I tell you that story because I think that's the story that we're trying to replicate through the work that we're doing. What we're trying to do is actually take people who have given up hope that their life will be any different, that the lives of their children will be any different, who are in subsistence state, sometimes less than subsistence state, who are relying on services and contributions from a variety of not-for-profit organizations who are often tapped out. Think of the lost potential. You know, we've got one of the strongest economies in the G7 right now. The middle class is doing better thanks to things like the Canada Child Benefit and the middle class tax cut. More than 500,000 jobs that you've all collectively created in the last 3 years. Unemployment is at 40-year lows. Now, as the Minister of Employment and Labour, when I travel around the country, I hear a new problem, which is where do I find that talent? How do I keep the people that I have invested in? What am I going to do about this new unit that I want to grow, but I can't find the people? Even from the not-for-profit sector, how do I find support workers? There's not enough. We have an aging population. So everybody's fighting for this talent pool. And so we have a new problem. And the problem is that we're going to have to dig deeper. We're going to have to dig into every bit of talent that we're leaving on the table. We have to make sure that if businesses are going to remain competitive and have opportunities to grow and innovate, that they have a trained workforce and that we've truly dug to the deepest wells of our talent pool as a country. We just can't afford to leave anybody behind. And the pace of technological change is rapid, and people need an opportunity to develop new skills and new opportunities in the workforce. So we've launched new policy and programs that can help workers adapt to changing circumstances and get the skills they need. And employers are seeking partnerships more and more and more, whether it's with academia, whether it's colleges, universities, polytechnics, whether it's with government, because they know that they need to work together to ensure that talent pool continues to grow. So some of the things that we've done is invest in things like an innovation and skills plan, to launch things like the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy so that we remain a global leader in this area. We've also launched something called the Global Skills Strategy. We saw an opportunity as our cousins to the south of us were tightening up opportunities to attract the best and brightest. We took a leap of faith and we decided that we would launch a strategy to actually ensure that people knew that Canada was a place that they could come if they had those rare talents and skills. And businesses worked with us, and now you can get somebody who has a very rare set of skills into the country within 3 weeks. A game changer for businesses that actually had the opportunity to unlock that next level of growth if they could find that person, attract and retain them. We invested in something called Skills Boots for workers that have been out of the workforce for over 10 years. This is an opportunity to either have more money through Canada's student grants to reflect the cost of living for older workers, but also flexible EI, even increased flexibility with employment insurance so that if an older worker is in a job where they have an opportunity to retrain in another field or within that particular company, they can take those supports and gain those opportunities. And I'm really excited about something we'll be talking about very soon, the launch of the Future Skills Centre. Now, this is really hard to explain to everyday Canadians, but the best way that I can explain this is we need to take bigger chances. We need to try new things, and we need to innovate in the area of skills development. And so we're really excited about the Future Skills Centre because this is a $500 million investment over a number of years that will allow us to really dig into what employers need, whether or not the way that we're delivering skills training as a country is effective for employers, for people, for Canadians, and whether we can see better integration between how people are learning and what employers need. So, as I said, the economy is doing well, and the labor shortages are a challenge. And so a big part of my job is tapping into those folks that have traditionally been left behind. So one of the things that we've had the ability to do, and we're working on now, we'll be able to talk about it in a couple of months, is the renewal of the youth employment strategy. Now, the majority of money that we spend on skills training is actually delivered through transfers to provinces and territories. And we've increased that money as well. We're excited about the new negotiations that we were able, or the agreements that we were able to achieve with the provinces and territories because it actually commits them to measuring outcomes, something that we've never done. I have to tell you, I was a little surprised when I landed in politics to realize that as the Government of Canada, we did very little outcome measurements. But the new labour market transfer agreements compel provinces to actually have a more robust analysis of outcomes. When we deliver training in XYZ way, what actually happens to the individual? How does that affect their earnings immediately? What does it look like 10 years from now? These are the kinds of questions that we have to be asking ourselves. So that's exciting. But the youth employment strategy is we've held on to a little pot of money. And the little pot of money that we deliver through the youth employment strategy is really for those most vulnerable young people, the ones that are typically left behind, the ones that oftentimes are not in school, not in work, that have a really difficult challenge getting into the labor market. And we have often delivered that in partnership with not-for-profit organizations, with colleges and universities, renewing the youth employment strategy to focus on the most vulnerable and ensure that there's better supports for people to thrive will actually result in, I think, better outcomes for young people and better outcomes for business. You know, one of the things that I'm excited about with the youth employment strategy is removing some of the barriers for young people that traditionally have been in place. So we're looking at recommendations that have come from business. Things like, should the Canada Summer Job Program have a criteria of being a student? Is that necessary? And these are the questions that we've been asking ourselves, so that we can broaden criteria and ensure that every young person who needs an opportunity in the workforce has that opportunity. We've also made changes to the Canada Student Loans and Grants. We've increased grants by up to 50% for middle class and lower income families. We're ensuring that students don't have to pay back their student debt until they're making at least $25,000 a year. This is important because I cannot tell you how many families I've spoken to who have never taken on student debt, who have never applied for Canada Student Loans, and who discourage their kids from actually applying for Canada Student Loans and Grants, despite the fact that in some cases they would be eligible for a very high level of grants. And that's because of the fear of debt. The fear that that child is going to have a really hard time if they graduate paying back that loan, even though we know that the majority of Canada's student loans are paid back. And so by making sure that students have some level of comfort that they will be able to earn a basic income before they're compelled to pay back their loan, it actually alleviates some of the stress and helps more people consider post-secondary who maybe haven't been able to consider that before. The investment in skills training and apprenticeships is really important as well, and I'm glad to see members of the skilled trades here today. You know, we have a skilled trades shortage in this country. 65,000 positions every single year go unfilled. Isn't that shocking? And those are the people that we rely on, the people who build things and fix things and innovate and engineer, the people that drive cranes and you know, build pipelines and big buildings. These are the folks that we need. And when I hear about a labor shortage in the skilled trades, what that means to me is a real hit to our economy and a loss of opportunity for so many young people who maybe haven't considered themselves in those professions. And part of it is the stigma of choosing a skilled trade. I have a son now who's an operating engineer, started off in welding, and I can't tell you how many times he heard jokes about his intelligence as a welder. We have to stop doing that. These are highly skilled professional positions. As a matter of fact, most of the business owners in Northern Ontario, where I come from, own the plumbing shop, own the electrical shop. They are the ones with the camps and the car. We call them camps, cottages, cottages and cars and great lifestyles. We have to stop stigmatizing the trades, and we're helping with that by investing in union-based training, for example, making sure that unions have up-to-date equipment that reflects the needs of trainers today, but also supporting unions to find members of underrepresented groups that maybe haven't seen themselves in the skilled trades. They're still very male-dominated. There's only about 4% women in the skilled trades overall. And so we want to change that number, and unions are working really diligently with us to make sure that they are opening their doors to anyone who can see themselves as having a potential pathway. So our focus, as I said, is creating a strong and resilient middle class, ensuring a fair chance for people. We believe this is good for people, this is good for the economy, and it will help address some of those labor shortages that employers are talking about. And making sure that everyone has access to skills training will give Canadians confidence that their government has their back as well. The second most frequently asked question that I get is, now that I've found the talent, how do I retain it? What am I going to do in this tight labor market where it's so competitive that employees are leaving? Well, I'll say that smart employers already know the secret to this. You know, they do provide flexibility. They do provide great benefits. They do provide rates of pay that are competitive, and they make sure that people have opportunities to continually develop. They encourage innovation. They encourage collaboration. But not all employers know this answer, and so to level the playing field, I've recently introduced changes to bring federal labor standards into the 21st century that will help support good quality jobs and help with that issue of retention. Most of you are probably familiar with these standards. There's standards obviously provincially, but in the federal, they're the same, federally regulated standards. They set minimums with regards to working conditions such as hours, wages, leaves, holidays, etc., for the federally regulated sectors, which is private and public. Many employers, as I said, already go over and above the minimum standards, especially in the federally regulated sector where we still have a high rate of unionization and many employers that are working in a very competitive setting. But for those employers that don't actually have that competitive setting, who are relying on the standards as the base minimum, you know, these standards are really outdated. They weren't actually renewed since the 60s. There's no provisions for sick days, for example. There's no protections for schedule changes. There's no protections for equal work of equal pay, and I'm not talking about the gender kind, I'm talking about the part-time versus full-time kind. And so for some employees, these are the only protections they have. So we know that as the nature of work is changing, we have to keep pace with the standards that we set as a minimum level of employment. So to make sure we got it right, we consulted with businesses, we consulted with labor groups, we consulted with Canadians. In fact, some of you most likely have participated in these consultations over the last year. And one message that we heard loud and clear was that as the work has changed in Canada, the labor standards have not. And so the changes that we would propose, some of the changes we're proposing would, among other things, eliminate minimum length of service requirements for general holiday pay, sick leave, maternity leave, and parental leave, help improve work-life balance by introducing new breaks and leaves, a new 5-day personal leave of which 3 days are paid. Those could be used for sick days. Those could be used for a family emergency. I think of all of the people that are stuck in a sandwich generation. You get the call that your elderly mother has fallen. There's not much you can do if there's no one else to go and manage that situation at the hospital. Very stressful for many, many people. 5 days of paid leave out of 10 days in total for victims of family violence, a Budget 2018 commitment to address the extra challenges that women face when they're leaving a domestic violence situation. And to ensure that employees in precarious work are paid and treated fairly by having access to labor standards that would introduce equal treatment protections, for example. And this is in addition to some of the earlier changes that we had to take immediately, like ending unpaid internships for young people that aren't attached to a course or a curriculum. Creating protections to prevent and address harassment and violence in the workplace through the recently passed Bill C-65. If we want to retain women, we're going to have to make sure that they dramatically experience less harassment in the workplace. And as we consulted, it also became clear that there were a number of really complex issues that we weren't going to solve with this round, but that deserved study and more examination. Things like a federal minimum wage. And so these will be studied by an expert panel that will be announced shortly. And we know that the changes that we're proposing will be challenging for some workplaces, not all. So we're going to continue to work with employers as we develop the regulations so that we really understand the impact and that we can work together to make sure that as we introduce these changes, that business has a voice in terms of how practically to do that. Business owners know that taking care of their biggest investment, their people, is actually connected to their bottom line. And when standards are higher, as I said, it makes recruitment and retention easier. Engaged employers and higher levels of employee satisfaction lead to an increase in productivity, lower turnover, lower recruitment costs, lower absenteeism. I can tell you as the operator of a homeless shelter, it was the most challenging piece of my job, was constantly recruiting. We weren't able to pay very high salaries. We didn't have a workplace that people would choose as their first choice. And the cost of actually recruiting people and training them and then losing them was one of the biggest hits to our budget. And it had implications beyond immediate costs. It actually had implications on our safety of our operation. The other challenge in terms of that constant churn is the challenge to reputation. You know, we all know that people know certain firms as great places to work and other organizations as not so great places to work, and that reputation has a value. And so we know that good employers protect that value, and they make sure that that reputation that they have out in the workforce is one that lives up to a standard that allows for better retention and attraction. So I wanted to talk a little bit also about proactive pay equity legislation. You know, we've just recently introduced this. I was happy to be with the Canadian Bankers Association to talk about proactive pay equity. In fact, many organizations have already proactively done this themselves and will have very little adjustments to make. But, you know, this is also connected to economic growth. We still have, well, there is a gender wage gap, and depending on who you talk to, it's 27 cents on the dollar all the way down to 13 cents on the dollar. So there are different varying numbers. But let's just assume that a woman earns 88 cents for every dollar that a man earns, and that's a sort of a conservative estimate. What a loss we have in terms of economic prosperity. Women need the opportunity to be fairly compensated for work of equal value. This is a hard conversation for many Canadians because they don't necessarily understand this. I see some nodding heads. I think probably some of you have gone through pay equity experiences. I was lucky to go through this as an employer when I ran the shelter because it gave me some insight and the ability to talk about this. But fundamentally what pay equity is about the valuation of what work that is typically considered female. That's the best way that I can describe it. You know, I was getting my makeup done the morning that I was doing an interview on pay equity, On Your Morning, I think it's called. And the woman who was doing my makeup, I asked her, I always talk to the people and the professionals I interact with in federally regulated places because I'm curious to know how they picked that job, what did they have to study in order to do it, how they land at this particular employer. So I was asking these questions, and so she had, gone through a series of college courses, and she had a diploma in cosmetology, or she was an esthetician, et cetera, et cetera. And we had this great conversation about pay equity and what it meant. And then I went and I got mic'd up by the guy who does the sound. And I asked him some similar questions. And I'm pretty sure that when a pay equity process goes through, those two jobs may be very similar in value. And I'm pretty sure that the cosmetologist or the esthetician is getting paid less. And that's because that job has always been considered female. And that's the best way I can describe pay equity. Two jobs that have similar complexity, similar levels of training and qualifications that are required, similar levels of responsibility, and one's paid less solely because it's mainly females who have done it historically. And we have typically and continually undervalued the work that women do. And so that's why I'm so excited about pay equity, because it will open up a broader conversation about how we value women's work. And it's a very exciting conversation to have. So I think our approach is striking a balance based on feedback from employers and unions, employees, advocacy stakeholders. I think that when we look at pay equity, for example, it will reduce litigation. It will reduce the large payments that we see through a complaint-based system that we currently have federally regulated. I think that, the changes that we're making to the labor code are going to actually result in a more level playing field for employers. I think that, when we have employers that are not doing the right thing by employees, they're profiting essentially at the expense of other employers who are doing the right thing. And I think that there's an opportunity to have a conversation about this from a purely economic perspective, that this is truly good for our economy when everybody does have a fair chance to succeed. We're still not there yet. We know that Indigenous people, people with disabilities, women and newcomers still struggle to participate in the workforce despite how hot the economy is, and they face systemic barriers. So it's great to talk to Michael about the work that he's doing through the Diversity Council, but we need more people having that conversation. And I think, the tightening labor market is helping to have that conversation, but I think we need allies in this work. We can't do it alone as a government, and we know that we can support the work that you're doing, but we need help to break down those systemic barriers. The work that we're doing at the federal level in terms of appointments to boards and tribunals is a perfect example of how hard it is. When we were appointed, there was a big deal made about a gender-balanced cabinet, and that was a big deal. First time in Canadian history. And the Prime Minister's answer is pretty legendary, too. He was pretty surprised that a reporter asked him why. And, essentially, his answer was, why not? Which is kind of a great way to think about it. But the other thing that we did in terms of diversity was actually, with the power that we had, change our appointment process to courts and tribunals and different kinds of boards that are federally regulated. And we dug deeper, and we asked people to apply, and we asked MPs to ask people to apply, people that hadn't traditionally been represented on these boards, women and people who were a visible minority, and Indigenous people, and people with disabilities. And then we thoughtfully dug and dug and dug, and we held off on some appointments until we could actually get the right people in place. And that's the kind of action I want all of you to do. I want all of you to take that challenge away today and think about how you personally can lead to a more inclusive, diverse workplace. How you personally are going to examine your own biases in the work that you do, and in the way that you ask questions in interviews, in the way that you recruit, in the way that you promote. Because that's how we're going to really get to a truly diverse, inclusive workplace. And believe me, it's beneficial for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. Some great comments there. We're going to turn to questions from the audience. I have a few already. If you haven't, there are cards on the table. Please write your questions legibly for the guy who didn't bring his glasses. So the first question we have here is, how will we ensure that literacy and essential skills are incorporated into the rollout of inclusive growth plans?
Oh, great. Well, that's a great question, and it's going to sound like I've done everything in my background, but I actually worked for an adult literacy group for a very long time in my younger years, and it's a very critical question. And I think when we're looking at reshaping things like the Youth Employment Strategy or the Aboriginal Skills Education Training Fund, which is money that's dedicated for First Nations training, one of the key things that we've heard over and over is we need flexibility in the way that we deliver the programming. You know, not everybody comes to skills training from the same place. And the way that government likes to design programs often is making it easy for us to assess the program and whether or not they fit a very strict set of criteria. You know, for example, with SkillsLink funding, which is really about helping the most vulnerable young people, there's a criteria around how many people will you have in your program? What is the gender breakdown? How many people will finish your program? And it's very formulaic. And so organizations are driven to sort of meet the metrics, if you will, rather than asking organizations, what do you need? How long would it take you to take an individual from point A to point B? What's the best way to serve the clients that you work with? You're working with very vulnerable young people. Is 26 weeks long enough? Is the way that you're delivering your services appropriate for that population? And so the work that I'm doing as Minister of Employment is actually reshaping things to restore control, for example, to Indigenous communities who know their people, who know how folks learn, and who know how long it takes to get from before a high school diploma to becoming a nurse, for example, and allowing them that runway to work with individuals to really understand what their own particular barriers are, and that would include literacy. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So we have a question from one of the students at CW Jeffries, Mosab, who I understand has been in Canada for 4 months. So welcome. I think
From
that's
Afghanistan.
From Afghanistan. Yeah, fantastic. So I'm a new Canadian, and I would like to know how a hardworking student can be sure of getting a good job after graduating from university.
Wow, that's a great question. First of all, welcome to Canada. I know I said that to you earlier, but we're so glad you're here. So let's give them a round of applause. That's why it's so important that all of you consider how you can actually increase diversity and inclusion in your workplace. Because we have newcomers, we have people with various barriers, whether it's because they're new to the country, whether it's because they are a visible minority, whether it's because they have a disability, who desperately want to participate. They want to be a great employee. They want to add value to your businesses. They want to contribute and innovate and grow and become entrepreneurs. And we are doing ourselves a disservice if we don't allow young people like this to participate to their fullest capacity. So the work that we're doing to make sure that you have the supports through student loans and grants, supports through training programs, work experience through paid co-ops, all of that is important. But if that person cannot find an organization that will see beyond someone's color or physical ability or indigeneity and gender, then all of that investment is lost. And that's why these conversations are so important. And so I want to thank you for asking that question. It also allows me to talk a little bit about immigration. You know, I'm here as the skills minister, as the person who's talking about employment and skills and training. But there's a really dangerous narrative going on right now, and I'm sure you're all aware of it. And that is a decidedly anti-immigration conversation coming from the other side. And I can tell you that it is entirely opposite to what I'm hearing from business, who is saying, more please, faster please. Even if we get all that talent trained up, it's just not enough. And so I need you to all be partners with me in saying that the narrative of immigration being a bad thing for Canada is not tolerable, that we cannot continue to meet our market needs, our labor needs, our growth targets if we don't welcome people from Afghanistan in, if we don't welcome people from Syria in, if we decide that we're going to reduce immigration levels, like Quebec has recently done. despite the fact that they have the lowest unemployment rate in the entire country. So it's a great question, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about another really important part of meeting our labor needs as a country.
Thanks. He set the bar high for his classmates, but I haven't seen any of them asking a question. Just saying. So will the Global Talent Stream program for foreign workers be extended?
It's a great question. You're right. It is a pilot project. We wanted to have some time to assess, first of all, whether it would work, whether employers would use it. The answer is yes. Whether or not we had the skills and occupations narrowed down or broad enough, the answer is I think we can broaden it. And whether or not it would be seen as beneficial by the business community, and the answer is yes. And so we are looking at how we can ensure that the Global Talent Strategy stays as a permanent program. Of course, I can't presuppose the budget 2019, but what I'll tell you is that we know we have a winner here, not just for business, but for our country.
So this will be our last question. You mentioned skills trades as a particular gap. What are the other gaps that are a focus for your programs?
Well, that's also a great question. Listen, there are gaps pretty much in every sector. What I'll tell you, though, is that one of the things that we have to turn our mind to is that almost every profession needs math skills. And so something that I'm hearing over and over and over from various sectors is that people are really concerned about sort of the fundamental skills, especially in the STEM sectors, that young people are essentially not gaining through the K-12 space. We do have an opportunity to work with provinces and territories on curriculum a little bit, but not a lot. Certainly, we're trying to accelerate that through the Investment and Future Skills Center, who I think will be able to help us identify how we get to meeting those gaps. I will say that really no matter where I go, I hear about gaps in various sectors, whether it's tourism, whether it's healthcare, whether it's skilled trades. As we see this tightening labor market, we see a real challenge for employers in a variety of sectors to find the talent they need. But what I'm excited about is the ability to work with the Future Skills Center on better sort of orienting how we're reaching people at every age and stage of development to make sure that they have the skills that employers are going to be able to use.
Thank you very much. Please help me in thanking the Minister. Minister Hajdu, on behalf of the Canadian Club of Toronto, I would like to extend our thanks for your speech today. There were a number of things that I took away from the speech. Not surprisingly, I would agree with most everything you said. But a couple things that stuck with me, things like calculating the cost of doing nothing, which is such an important thing. We can have a bit of foresight in saying, oh, this is going to save us this money on this program. But the reality is, what's it going to look like in 5 or 10 years? The talent shortage is one that my organization deals with on a daily basis, talking to employers about the reality that you're just not in a position to turn anyone away at this point. But on top of that, we need people in good paying jobs because that impacts society as a whole. And I often think about doctors who come to Canada and they find themselves in survival jobs driving cabs where they're making minimum wage or relatively close to minimum wage. Whereas if they were allowed to practice in their field, they would be making $300,000, $400,000, which in turn would mean increased tax dollars, which would go back into infrastructure and so on and so forth. So some wonderful things that you shared with us today. A couple things before we conclude. A couple events coming up I want to tell you about. On Tuesday, November the 13th, the Chief Operating Officer of the National Football League, Marianne Turk, will be here to talk about the resilience of the NFL. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. The NFL is not Canadian football, I don't know what Canadian football is, so moving on. Yes. And on Thursday, November 14th, we will host a dynamic panel of experts to address Canada's innovation and technology strategies. Please visit our website at canadianclub.org to purchase tickets. Once again, I would like to thank today's event sponsor, McCarthy Tetro, for your generous support. I would also like to thank MediaEvents.ca and Canada's online event space and VVC for live streaming today's event. Thank you all for being us today, either in person or online, and we look forward to having you at an event soon. Enjoy your day.